When conflict first entered the written world, long before history books, long before borders were drawn on maps, and long before armies marched beneath banners, humans lived in fragile balance with one another. Early societies were small, bound by kinship, shared labor, and survival. Conflict existed, of course, but it was fleeting, remembered only through scars, broken tools, or stories whispered by firelight. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was permanent. Then something changed. At a quiet moment in human history, when writing itself was still new and precious, a war was carved into stone. Not sung, not whispered, but recorded. For the first time, violence between organized societies was preserved beyond memory. Names were etched, victories were declared, enemies were defined. This moment did not simply mark the beginning of recorded warfare. It marked the moment when conflict became history. The world's first recorded war did not erupt from chaos, but from order. It grew between two structured city-states, each governed by laws, gods, and rulers who believed their claims were justified. This war was not random violence. It was organized, deliberate, and documented. It tells us not only how humans fought, but why they began to fight in ways that would shape civilization forever. This is the story of that first war, not told through legend, but through stone, not remembered by myth, but by writing. And it begins in the cradle of civilization itself. Section 1. The land between rivers and the birth of organized conflict. The first recorded war took place in ancient Mesopotamia, a land whose name means between the rivers. Nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, this fertile region gave birth to agriculture, writing, law, and inevitably, organized conflict. By around 2600 BCE, Mesopotamia was no longer a scattering of villages. It was a network of powerful city-states, each surrounded by walls, ruled by kings, and protected by gods. Among these cities were Lagash and Umma, two neighbors whose rivalry would become the earliest war preserved in human history. At the heart of their conflict was something deceptively simple: land and water. In a world dependent on agriculture, control of irrigation channels meant survival. Fields fed populations, sustained armies, and supported temples. The boundary between Lagash and Umma ran through fertile territory, nourished by canals that both cities depended on. Over time, disputes over these resources intensified. What began as disagreements hardened into resentment. Resentment grew into hostility. Unlike earlier undocumented clashes, this conflict unfolded between societies capable of recording events. Scribes carved words into clay and stone. Rulers commissioned monuments to preserve their victories. For the first time, war was not just fought, it was remembered intentionally. The ruler of Lagash, Eannatum, emerged as the central figure in this conflict. He was not merely a warrior king, but a symbol of early state power. Under his leadership, Lagash framed the war not only as a political necessity, but as a divine mandate. According to inscriptions, The gods themselves favored Lagash and condemned Umma for violating sacred boundaries. This framing mattered deeply. War was no longer just about survival. It became a moral struggle. Victory meant divine approval. Defeat meant cosmic judgment. This concept would echo through thousands of years of human conflict. The most extraordinary artifact from this war is known as the Steel of the Vultures. Carved in limestone, it depicts soldiers marching in formation, enemies crushed beneath their feet, and vultures carrying the severed heads of the defeated. This is not symbolic violence. It is explicit, organized, and chillingly methodical. For the first time in human history, we see war as a state-controlled enterprise. Soldiers are uniform. Command is centralized. Violence is purposeful. The battlefield is not chaotic. It is disciplined. What makes this moment so significant is not simply the brutality, but the intention behind its documentation. Iannatum wanted future generations to know what happened. The steel served as a warning, a justification, and a declaration of power. It marked territory, asserted authority, and immortalized dominance. This war also reveals something deeply human, the desire to control narrative. Lagash's version of events portrays Umma as the aggressor, the oath-breaker, the violator of divine law. Whether this was entirely true no longer matters. What matters is that history was being shaped by those who had the power to write it. Here, at the dawn of recorded history, we already see patterns that will define warfare forever. Conflicts over resources, justification through religion, propaganda through monuments, the glorification of victory, the silencing of the defeated. The people of Umma left no monument of their own. Their voice survives only through their enemy's account. This imbalance is itself a lesson. History remembers not the righteous, but the recorded. Yet this war was not endless. Treaties followed. Boundaries were redrawn. Oaths were sworn again. Life continued. Fields were replanted. Temples remained standing. The world did not collapse. It adapted. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling realization. Organized war did not destroy civilization. It became part of it. From this moment onward, conflict would walk beside progress. Writing would record not only trade and prayers, but bloodshed. Kings would measure greatness not just in harvests, but in victories. The war between Lagash and Umma did not merely happen in history. It created history. It taught humanity how to fight, how to remember fighting, and how to justify it. And once that door was opened, it could never be closed again. Section 2. The First Soldiers. How war was actually fought. When we imagine the first recorded war, it is tempting to picture chaos, angry crowds rushing at one another with crude weapons, driven by instinct rather than strategy. But the archaeological evidence tells a very different story. The war between Lagash and Umma reveals something far more unsettling. By the time war entered written history, it was already organized, disciplined, and deliberate. The soldiers of this early conflict were not random villagers pulled into violence on a whim. They were members of a structured society that understood hierarchy, command, and collective movement. The steel of the vultures shows ranks of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, holding identical weapons, protected by large rectangular shields. This image alone tells us that warfare had already evolved into something methodical. These soldiers were likely farmer warriors, men who worked the fields during planting and harvest seasons and trained for battle when conflict arose. Their loyalty was not to abstract ideals, but to their city, their ruler, and their gods. To fight was not simply to kill, it was to defend the divine order that governed their world. Weapons were simple but effective. The most common arms were spears, short swords, and maces, designed for close combat. Spears allowed soldiers to strike from behind shield walls, while maces, heavy, blunt instruments, were meant to crush bone through armor. There was little elegance in these tools. They were built for efficiency, not honor. Armor was minimal by modern standards, but represented advanced thinking for the time. Soldiers wore leather garments or thick textiles, sometimes reinforced with metal plates. Helmets, often made of copper or bronze, protected the skull, the most vulnerable part of the body. Shields were large and heavy, forming a defensive barrier when soldiers advanced together. This style of combat required discipline. A lone fighter was vulnerable, but a formation was powerful. Soldiers trained to move as one, to hold position, even when fear threatened to overwhelm them. In this way, early warfare began shaping not just bodies, but minds. Obedience, endurance, and suppression of individual panic became survival traits. Command structure was clear. Kings like Adam did not merely rule from palaces, they led armies. Below them were officers who relayed commands, organized formations, and maintained order. Communication was likely carried out through shouted orders, drums, or visual signals. Even without writing on the battlefield, coordination was essential. But war was not constant. Battles were moments of extreme intensity, surrounded by long periods of waiting. Soldiers camped, marched, and prepared, all while carrying the weight of uncertainty. Food supplies had to be transported, weapons maintained, and morale preserved. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion were as dangerous as the enemy. Psychological warfare also played a role. The steel of the vultures does not merely depict victory, it intimidates. Images of mutilated enemies and divine favor were meant to send a message: resistance is futile. Even in the first recorded war, fear was a weapon. Religion infused every aspect of combat. Soldiers believed the gods watched the battlefield, choosing sides and determining outcomes. Victory was proof of divine approval. Defeat suggested spiritual failure. Before battle, rituals were performed, offerings made, and omens interpreted. War was not just physical, it was cosmic. Death in battle was final and unforgiving. There were no medics, no evacuation systems, no real treatment for serious wounds. A spear thrust or crushed skull ended a life swiftly. Bodies were often left on the battlefield, especially those of the defeated. The vultures shown in the steel are not symbolic, they reflect reality. Yet, despite this brutality, war was seen as necessary. It protected resources, reinforced borders, and maintained social order. A city that could not defend itself would not survive. In this sense, war became an extension of governance. What is striking is how familiar this all feels. Even at the very beginning of recorded warfare, we see the foundations of military systems that would persist for millennia. Uniforms, formations, command hierarchy, propaganda, religious justification, and psychological intimidation. The soldiers of Lagash and Umma were not primitive anomalies. They were the ancestors of every army that followed. They marched not just into battle, but into history. Section 3. Why the First War Began. Land, water, and the fear of survival. The first recorded war in human history did not begin with hatred, pride, or a desire for conquest. It began with something far more ordinary and far more dangerous: water. In ancient Mesopotamia, land itself was not enough. Survival depended on controlling rivers, canals, and irrigation systems. Without water, crops failed. Without crops, cities starved. And starvation, more than any ideology, has always been the most powerful force pushing humans toward violence. Lagash and Umma were neighboring city-states in a region where rainfall was scarce and unpredictable. Their prosperity relied on an intricate system of canals fed by the Tigris River. These canals did not simply water fields. They defined borders, power, and economic survival. Control of water was control of life. Between the two cities lay a fertile strip of land known as the Guedena, meaning the edge of the plain. It was not vast, but it was valuable. Whoever controlled it could feed more people, support more workers, and maintain a stronger army. Over time, this land became a point of constant tension. At first, disputes were likely resolved through negotiation. Early records suggest that treaties existed, boundaries were marked, and agreements were sworn before the gods. In one such treaty, Umma was allowed to use part of the land in exchange for grain payments to Lagash. On paper, peace existed. In reality, resentment grew. Umma struggled to meet its obligations. Grain shortages, poor harvests, or internal pressures may have made the payments difficult. At the same time, Lagash watched its neighbor benefit from land that it believed was rightfully its own. What began as an agreement slowly transformed into a source of bitterness. This is a crucial point. The first recorded war did not begin suddenly. It simmered. It grew quietly, nourished by small injustices, unmet promises, and fear of future scarcity. When Umma eventually stopped paying the agreed tribute, the balance collapsed. Lagash interpreted this not just as theft, but as defiance, an insult to both political authority and divine order. In a world where rulers governed by claiming the favor of gods, ignoring an agreement was more than a legal breach. It was sacrilege. Eonatum, the ruler of Lagash, framed the conflict as a righteous response. According to inscriptions, the god Ningirsu himself demanded action. This framing mattered. It transformed a territorial dispute into a sacred duty. War became inevitable, not because humans desired it, but because their worldview left no room for compromise once divine authority was invoked. Water intensified everything. Canals could be blocked, diverted, or destroyed. A single act of sabotage could ruin an entire growing season. Farmers depended on precise timing. Too much water drowned crops, too little killed them. When tensions rose, even rumors of interference could trigger panic. Imagine living in a city where your family's survival depends on water flowing through a narrow channel dug into dry earth. Now imagine hearing that a rival city might cut that flow. The fear would not be abstract. It would be immediate and personal. This fear likely spread through markets, workshops, and homes. Soldiers were not the only ones preparing for conflict. Farmers stockpiled grain. Families reinforced walls. Priests interpreted omens. The entire city entered a state of quiet anticipation. When war finally came, it was not seen as chaos. It was seen as resolution. A way to end uncertainty by force. The first recorded war shows us something uncomfortable. Violence often arises not from aggression, but from systems stretched too tightly to allow flexibility. Mesopotamian cities were marvels of organization, but that organization left little margin for failure. One bad harvest, one broken agreement, and collapse loomed. Unlike later empires, these early city-states could not retreat into vast territories. Their survival zones were small, fragile, and deeply interconnected. Conflict with a neighbor was not optional. It was existential. The geography itself encouraged war. Flat plains offered little natural defense. Borders were invisible and easy to contest. Without mountains or forests to separate populations, disputes became personal and immediate. This closeness also meant that war was intimate. Soldiers often fought people who spoke the same language, worshipped similar gods, and lived only a short walk away. There was no concept of a distant enemy. War was neighbor against neighbor. Yet despite this closeness, compromise failed. Why? Because early political systems relied heavily on absolute authority. Kings ruled by claiming divine endorsement. To concede land or water was to admit weakness, not just politically, but spiritually. A ruler who compromised too much risked losing legitimacy altogether. Thus, war became safer than peace. Peace required flexibility, trust, and shared sacrifice. War required only obedience and belief. The inscriptions from Lagash emphasize this logic repeatedly. Akhenaten did not describe himself as a conqueror. He described himself as an instrument. The war was not his choice. It was destiny, commanded by the gods. This narrative mattered because it justified the cost. War meant death. It meant fields left unattended, canals damaged, families grieving. But if war preserved divine order, then suffering became acceptable, necessary, even. This mindset would echo through history again and again. Empires would rise, claiming they fought for justice. Kingdoms would wage war in the name of faith. Nations would defend borders drawn by rivers, resources, and fear. All of it was already present in the first war ever recorded. The tragedy is not that war happened, but that it made sense. In a world balanced on water and grain, violence became a rational response to uncertainty. The First War was not a failure of humanity's morality. It was a failure of humanity's systems to allow peaceful change. And once war solved the problem, once Lagash defeated Umma and secured control, another lesson was learned. Force works. That lesson would never be forgotten. Section 4. How the First War was fought. Soldiers, weapons, and silent fear. When we imagine the first war ever recorded, it is tempting to picture chaos, untrained crowds clashing wildly, driven by anger rather than strategy. The reality, however, was far more deliberate, structured, and unsettlingly calm. By the time Lagash and Umma went to war, violence was not an improvisation. It was organized. This alone tells us something crucial. War did not emerge suddenly. It evolved alongside administration, labor systems, and early forms of government. The same structures that built temples and canals also built armies. Soldiers in ancient Mesopotamia were not professional warriors in the modern sense, but they were not amateurs either. Most were farmers, laborers, and craftsmen who were periodically called to serve. Their daily work already trained their bodies, hauling stones, digging earth, carrying loads under the sun. Strength and endurance were part of life. When war came, the city redirected this labor toward violence. Weapons were simple but brutally effective. Spears with copper or bronze tips dominated the battlefield. Axes, daggers, and heavy clubs followed. Shields made of wood and leather offered limited protection, forcing soldiers to fight in close formation. This is where discipline mattered. The famous Still of the Vultures shows soldiers of Lagash standing shoulder to shoulder, spears forward, shields overlapping. This formation resembles an early phalanx, a wall of bodies moving as one. It required training, trust, and coordination. One man stepping out of line could break the formation. Fear had to be controlled. Fear, however, was everywhere. There were no distant battlefields. Armies marched only a few kilometers from home. Soldiers could sometimes see the outlines of familiar canals, temples, or fields as they advanced. The land they fought over was the land they had plowed. This closeness intensified the emotional weight of combat. Victory meant survival. Defeat meant watching your city starve. Before battle, rituals were performed. Priests consulted omens, examined animal entrails, observed the sky. These rituals were not superstition alone. They were psychological preparation. They reassured soldiers that the gods approved of what they were about to do. Belief was armor. Without belief, fear would have been overwhelming. Death in battle was brutal. There were no medical systems capable of treating serious wounds. A deep cut often meant infection and slow death. Soldiers knew this, yet they marched. Commanders like Eonatum did not fight alone. They led from the front, both symbolically and physically. Rulers were expected to demonstrate courage. Their presence reinforced the idea that the war was sacred, not merely political. When battle began, there was no dramatic signal, no horns announcing the charge. Engagements likely started with cautious movement, formations tightening, eyes locked on the opposing line. Silence, then impact, the sound of shields striking, spears hitting wood and flesh, bodies falling. Combat was intimate. Soldiers saw faces. They felt resistance. There was no distance to hide behind. This intimacy made killing harder but also more effective. Once formations broke, panic spread quickly. Fear moved faster than orders. The Still of the Vultures depicts defeated enemies trampled underfoot, bodies stripped and discarded. This was not exaggeration. Defeat meant humiliation as well as death. Captured enemies could be executed, enslaved, or left unburied, a fate deeply feared in Mesopotamian belief systems. Burial mattered. To die without proper rites meant unrest in the afterlife. War threatened not just life, but spiritual peace. This fear was weaponized. Victorious armies displayed bodies or trophies as warnings. The goal was not only to win the battle, but to break the enemy's will to resist in the future. War was communication. After battle, the work was not over. Fields were reclaimed. Boundaries were remarked. Victorious rulers recorded the event in stone. These inscriptions mattered more than memory. Stone made war permanent. Eonatum's inscriptions describe divine punishment raining down on Umma, nets cast by the gods, enemies crushed by holy power. This language transformed violence into cosmic order. By recording the war, Lagash ensured that future generations would inherit not just land, but a story where force was justified, necessary, and blessed. This is perhaps the most important legacy of the first recorded war. It did not just establish borders, it established precedent. Future rulers could look back and say, "This is how conflicts are resolved. This is how gods act. This is how cities survive." The structure of war, soldiers, formations, rituals, records, became a template. Over time, weapons improved, armies grew larger, strategies more complex, but the core remained the same: fear managed by belief. Violence organized by authority. Even in its earliest form, war was not random destruction. It was a system, and systems, once proven effective, are difficult to abandon. The soldiers who fought this first recorded war returned home changed. Some carried wounds, some carried memories they could not share. There was no language yet for trauma, but it existed. Cities remembered victory. Individuals remembered loss. This imbalance between collective glory and personal suffering would follow humanity into every war that came after. The first war taught cities how to fight. It also taught humans how to endure fighting. And that knowledge, once learned, could never be unlearned. Section 5. After the blood settled, what the first war changed forever. When the fighting ended between Lagash and Umma, there was no celebration in the way we imagine it today. No cheering crowds, no victory parades, no songs sung in the streets. The end of the first recorded war was quieter, heavier, and far more complex. The battlefield fell silent first. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Some were retrieved by their own city. Others were left behind, exposed to the sun and scavenging animals. In the ancient Mesopotamian worldview, this mattered deeply. To be left unburied was not merely disrespect, it was a spiritual disaster. The dead were believed to wander restlessly, unable to reach the afterlife. This fear lingered long after the fighting stopped. War did not end when the last spear was lowered. It continued in the form of memory, ritual, and rebuilding. Cities had to make sense of what had happened. Violence on this scale demanded explanation. And so, the most powerful transformation occurred not on the battlefield, but in the mind. For the first time, humans were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Organized violence worked. Lagash had gained territory. Umma had lost land and power. The message was clear and terrifyingly simple. Force could reshape reality. This realization changed how cities governed themselves. After the war, boundaries were no longer just lines agreed upon by tradition or mutual understanding. They became sacred, guarded, enforced. Stones were placed, inscriptions carved, markers blessed by gods. Borders became permanent ideas. This was a new psychological shift. Land was no longer just shared earth. It was property worth killing for. This idea would echo throughout all of human history. But the changes went deeper. Rulers emerged stronger than before. Eannatum was no longer merely a king. He was a victor chosen by the gods. His authority expanded beyond administration into moral and cosmic legitimacy. War elevated leadership. From this point forward, successful rulers would be expected to defend, expand, and punish. Peace alone was no longer enough to prove strength. The ability to wage war became a qualification for power. This altered the structure of leadership permanently. Cities began preparing for future conflicts, even during times of peace. Weapons were stored, walls reinforced, soldiers trained intermittently. The idea of a standing defensive force began to take shape. War became a possibility that never left. Daily life changed subtly but significantly. Farmers returned to their fields, knowing that the land they worked had been fought over. Canals were repaired not only for irrigation, but for strategic importance. Roads mattered more. Communication mattered more. Even religion changed. Before the war, gods were primarily protectors of fertility, weather, and harvests. After the war, they became warriors. Divine violence entered mythology in a new way. Gods were now described as crushing enemies, casting nets, spilling blood. This language normalized war at a cosmic level. If the gods fought, humans could too. This was a crucial psychological justification. Without it, war would have been unbearable. The defeated city, Umma, underwent a different transformation. Loss brought humiliation. The defeated were forced to accept new boundaries, new rules, new power dynamics. Resentment simmered quietly. Injustice, real or perceived, became memory. This is how cycles of war begin. The first recorded war did not end conflict. It taught cities how to remember conflict. Memory became weaponized. Children grew up hearing stories of victory or defeat. These stories shaped identity. They created us and them. Pride and bitterness were inherited emotionally, even if borders shifted physically. This intergenerational memory ensured that war would not be an isolated event. For the first time, humanity crossed an invisible threshold. War became part of culture, not an accident, not a tragedy alone, but a tool. Writing played a central role in this shift. The inscriptions carved after the war did not describe suffering in detail. They focused on triumph, divine approval, and punishment of enemies. Pain was edited out. Complexity was simplified. This selective storytelling mattered. It taught future generations that war had winners and that winners were righteous. The silence surrounding loss is one of the most haunting aspects of early warfare. We do not hear the voices of grieving families, injured soldiers, or displaced farmers. Their suffering was not carved into stone. What survived was power. This imbalance would repeat itself throughout history. Wars would be remembered by dates, leaders, and outcomes, rarely by the quiet devastation left behind. The First War established this pattern. It also changed how humans thought about time. Before war, history was cyclical: seasons, floods, harvests. After war, time gained events. There was a before and an after. War became a marker in human memory. This shift allowed for the concept of progress, decline, revenge, and destiny. History became something that moved forward through conflict. Perhaps the most profound change was internal. Humans learned that they were capable of organized destruction on a scale previously unimagined. This knowledge brought fear, but also confidence. If we can destroy, we can control. This mindset would fuel empires. Yet, alongside this newfound power, something fragile emerged: an awareness of loss that could not be undone. Once blood is spilled intentionally, innocence cannot be reclaimed. The people of Lagash and Umma returned to their lives, knowing that peace was temporary. The earth remembered footsteps of soldiers. The canals had seen blood. Even in quiet moments, war lingered. This is why the First War matters so deeply, not because of how many died, not because of who won, but because it permanently altered the human relationship with violence. From that moment forward, war was no longer unthinkable. It was possible, and once something becomes possible, history shows it rarely stays unused. Section 6. When war became a system, not a moment. The First War did not only change minds, it changed structures. Once the conflict between Lagash and Umma ended, something invisible but permanent remained behind: organization. War was no longer an eruption of anger or a spontaneous clash. It had proven itself as a repeatable process, and humans are very good at repeating things that work. Cities began to reorganize themselves around the assumption that war could happen again. This was new. Before, danger came from floods, droughts, or disease, forces beyond human control. War was different. War came from other people. That difference reshaped everything. Storage systems expanded first. Grain was no longer only saved for famine, but also for soldiers. Feeding an army required planning, surplus, and logistics. This forced cities to improve accounting, measurement, and record keeping. In other words, bureaucracy grew because of war. Clay tablets that once tracked simple trade now recorded rations, troop numbers, and supplies. Administration became sharper, stricter, more hierarchical. Someone had to decide who received food and who did not. This is where inequality deepened. Those closest to power were protected. Those farthest away bore the risk. Military roles slowly separated from civilian life. Not fully, not yet, but noticeably. Certain men were expected to fight. Others were expected to build, harvest, or repair. Identity began to form around function. You were not just a person anymore. You were a role. Weapons production followed the same pattern. Spears, shields, and helmets required skilled labor. Metal work improved. Workshops expanded. Tools once used for farming were refined for killing. Technology stopped being neutral. Every improvement now carried the possibility of harm. Cities also began mapping space differently. High ground mattered more. Visibility mattered. Access points mattered. Walls were no longer symbolic. They were strategic. The city itself became a defensive machine. This altered architecture permanently. Narrow gates, thick walls, guarded entrances, even temples were placed with protection in mind. Sacred and military space blended together. Religion adapted again. Priests began blessing weapons, soldiers, and campaigns. War rituals became formalized. Omens were read not just for harvests, but for battles. The gods were consulted before violence, as if to soften its moral weight. This gave war a sense of inevitability. If the gods approved, who could object? But perhaps the most important change was how conflict was anticipated. For the first time, humans began imagining wars that had not yet happened. Planning replaced reaction. Scouts were sent beyond borders. Intelligence mattered. Rumors became tools. Information became power. Suspicion entered daily life. Neighbors were no longer just neighbors. They were potential enemies. Trust narrowed. Alliances became conditional. Peace treaties were written knowing they could be broken. This psychological shift was enormous. Fear was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name, a direction. Children grew up watching preparations they did not understand. They learned, without being told, that safety was fragile, that walls existed for a reason, that men left the city and sometimes did not return. Normal life absorbed war quietly. Even language changed. Words for destruction, domination, and victory became common. Metaphors of battle entered speech. Life itself began to be described as struggle, conquest, survival. This linguistic shift mattered. When language normalizes violence, thought follows. One of the most chilling developments was the acceptance of collateral damage. Fields destroyed, canals diverted, livestock taken, civilians displaced. These were no longer seen as tragedies. They were tactics. War taught humans to think in terms of sacrifice without consent. And once that logic exists, it spreads. The defeated city did not simply recover. It adapted, it hardened, it learned. Loss became instruction. This ensured that the next war would be more efficient, and it was. Though centuries would pass, the template was set. Future wars would follow the same structure: justification, preparation, execution, remembrance. The first war became the blueprint. What makes this moment haunting is how ordinary it eventually felt. There was no moment where humans collectively paused and said, "This is too much." Instead, war slid quietly into daily reality. People adapted because they had to, and adaptation is not the same as acceptance, but it leads there. By the end of this transformation, something irreversible had occurred. War was no longer an exception to human behavior. It was a system supported by administration, belief, architecture, technology, and memory. And systems, once built, are very hard to dismantle. Section 7: The soldiers, the strategy, and the human cost. With the evolution of war from a spontaneous clash to an organized system, the human element became even more pronounced. The first recorded battle between Lagash and Umma wasn't simply about who wielded the stronger spear or who shouted the loudest. It was about the preparation, discipline, and psychological endurance of the soldiers themselves, elements that would define combat for millennia. These early fighters were not professional soldiers in the way we think of them today. They were farmers, herders, and craftsmen who were pulled from daily life and thrust into a world where survival required a combination of instinct, training, and sheer willpower. Their homes, their families, and the routines they had relied on for years were suddenly subordinate to the needs of a city that demanded protection and dominance. This transformation from civilian to combatant was abrupt and total. A man who once tilled fields or tended livestock had to learn to march in formation, respond to signals, and cooperate in ways that emphasized group cohesion over individual desire. Any failure could result not only in personal death, but in the potential collapse of an entire unit. The organization of these troops reflected a keen awareness of human behavior. Leaders began to recognize that fear, loyalty, and morale were as powerful as any spear or shield. Soldiers needed to believe in the purpose of their fight. Propaganda, in the form of stories, omens, and public declarations, became tools to inspire courage and suppress hesitation. The gods themselves were invoked not just for protection, but for legitimacy, linking the divine will to the political aims of the city. Priests, often present at the front lines, performed rituals that bound the warrior's sense of duty to cosmic order, reinforcing the belief that failing in battle was not only a civic loss, but a spiritual one. Training methods evolved as necessity dictated. Drill formations were introduced to improve coordination. Younger fighters learned from veterans who had survived previous skirmishes. Weapons were no longer simple tools, but extensions of strategy. Spears were crafted to specific lengths, shields balanced for mobility and defense, and early armor designed for a compromise between protection and endurance. These were not standardized in the modern sense, but the careful attention to their effectiveness demonstrates a proto-engineering approach to combat, a melding of material science, human anatomy, and tactical necessity. One of the most striking aspects of early warfare was the psychological warfare employed. Even before armies clashed, leaders understood that intimidation could shape outcomes without bloodshed. Rumors were spread deliberately. Exaggerated troop numbers, tales of supernatural support, or ominous portents designed to sow fear in the enemy. The timing of attacks was carefully calculated. Dawn assaults leveraged sleepiness. Evening engagements exploited fatigue. Scouts and messengers became the unseen threads of a network that could determine victory or defeat. The human brain was the battlefield just as much as the field itself. Casualties were not merely physical. Survivors often returned with trauma that shaped their communities. Witnessing the deaths of neighbors, family, and comrades embedded a collective memory of fear and resilience. Songs, stories, and murals began to depict the battles, encoding strategies and experiences into culture. These narratives ensured that even those who did not fight directly understood the stakes, creating a social fabric woven with both caution and pride. Fear, skill, and honor became intertwined values, passed from one generation to the next, forming the earliest cultural memory of organized conflict. Logistics also became a crucial concern. Feeding and supplying a growing army required foresight. The first recorded war introduced the concept of supply lines and storage planning. Grain had to be protected from theft and decay. Water sources had to be maintained. Transport of weapons and materials required coordination. These mundane details, often overlooked in tales of heroism, were essential to survival. A single mismanaged granary could determine the outcome of a battle just as decisively as the bravery of a soldier. The administrative burden of war began to expand, creating new positions, hierarchies, and responsibilities that blurred the line between governance and military command. The human cost extended to civilians as well. While soldiers faced immediate danger, those who remained in cities or nearby settlements endured indirect consequences. Fields were destroyed to prevent enemy occupation, livestock requisitioned, and roads patrolled to control movement. Families often lived under the threat of invasion or raid, making daily life a delicate balance between productivity and survival. This blurred boundary between the battlefield and civilian life meant that war reshaped the entire societal structure, fostering resilience, but also embedding a perpetual sense of vulnerability. Strategy evolved alongside these human factors. Leaders began to understand the importance of terrain, timing, and psychological manipulation. The layout of cities, previously designed primarily for trade or ritual purposes, was reconsidered to include fortifications, hidden paths, and defensive positions. Understanding the weaknesses of an opponent became as critical as strengthening one's own position. Even the simplest skirmishes involved multiple layers of planning: reconnaissance, positioning, contingencies, and retreat strategies. What was once chaotic became, in a sense, predictable. A grim system with rules and consequences. Perhaps the most profound legacy of these early battles was the codification of honor and duty. The warriors of Lagash and Umma created unwitting precedents: loyalty to one's group, courage in the face of danger, and the concept of strategic sacrifice. These ideals transcended individual lives, embedding themselves into the consciousness of early civilizations. Later generations would recall these principles, codifying them into laws, traditions, and education, the invisible scaffolding for societies that still understood war as both a necessity and a moral trial. Finally, the section closes on reflection. The First War was not only about land or power. It was about humanity itself, revealing the lengths to which people would go to protect, dominate, and survive. Soldiers carried not only weapons, but the weight of their community's expectations, fears, and dreams. Every spear thrust, shield raised, and maneuver executed was a reflection of human ingenuity and human cost intertwined. From these early battles arose lessons about strategy, leadership, psychology, and societal organization that echoed across millennia, demonstrating that the human dimension of warfare, courage, fear, adaptation, and memory, would always be as critical as any technological advancement. Section 8. The Aftermath: How the First War Shaped Societies. The conclusion of the first recorded war between Lagash and Umma did not simply mark the end of hostilities, it opened an entirely new chapter in human civilization, demonstrating that warfare was more than a series of battles. It was a catalyst for social, political, and technological transformation. While the clashing armies eventually disbanded and the surviving soldiers returned to their villages, the consequences of the conflict rippled through the societies involved, influencing governance, culture, economy, and even the very perception of human mortality. One of the immediate and most profound impacts was on political organization. Cities like Lagash realized that defense and offense could not rely solely on ad hoc mobilization. The necessity of coordinating large groups of people, managing supplies, and maintaining morale during prolonged conflicts revealed the limitations of informal leadership. From this awareness emerged more structured hierarchies, councils of elders, military leaders, and administrators who could plan campaigns and enforce strategies became essential. Decision-making, once perhaps communal or dictated by ritual, now required efficiency and foresight. The First War had demonstrated that survival often depended not on individual valor alone, but on collective coordination, strategic thinking, and the ability to delegate authority effectively. The war also drove innovations in technology and infrastructure. Though we often imagine early armies wielding rudimentary weapons, the reality was that necessity accelerated experimentation. Weapons had to be more reliable, durable, and effective. Shields were reinforced, spears sharpened and balanced for optimal use, and early forms of armor were tested in real combat conditions. Some settlements began storing surplus materials, experimenting with metalworking techniques, and even developing rudimentary siege tools. Roads and paths were cleared and maintained, both to facilitate troop movement and to ensure that supply lines remained intact. These practical improvements in infrastructure and technology were not isolated. They served daily life and commerce as well, highlighting how war indirectly advanced the material development of early societies. Beyond logistics and technology, the First War profoundly affected the psychological and cultural fabric of these communities. The memory of battle, the loss of lives, and the heroic deeds of individuals were immortalized in the first known forms of written records, artistic depictions, and oral storytelling. Murals, inscriptions, and symbolic artifacts began to serve as both warnings and lessons for future generations. Through these memorials, communities codified moral and societal norms, emphasizing values such as courage, loyalty, and resilience. Even at this early stage, the war had become a shared narrative, a common story that bound communities together while defining what it meant to belong to a particular city-state. The human cost of war, however, was starkly evident in daily life. Survivors returned not only with physical injuries, but also with the invisible weight of trauma. Families who lost breadwinners faced starvation or displacement, and communities had to adapt quickly to restore agricultural production, trade, and social cohesion. The war reshaped demographic patterns, often consolidating populations in safer, more fortified areas, which inadvertently led to urbanization and centralized planning. The need for protection encouraged the construction of defensive walls, watchtowers, and gates, transforming villages into proto-cities capable of sustaining larger populations. Warfare had become a force that accelerated societal evolution, intertwining survival with organizational innovation. Interestingly, The First War also highlighted the interdependence of neighboring societies. While Lagash and Umma were locked in conflict, they could not exist entirely in isolation. Trade routes, shared water sources, and environmental factors forced both cities to negotiate alliances, even during periods of tension. Diplomacy emerged as a critical skill, and leaders learned that military power alone was insufficient to guarantee long-term security. Treaties, boundary agreements, and mediated settlements became as crucial as the weapons wielded in battle. This interplay between conflict and cooperation set the stage for a sophisticated understanding of politics that would define early civilization. Religion and ritual were equally transformed. Priests and spiritual leaders interpreted the outcomes of battle as messages from the divine, linking victory or defeat to moral and cosmic order. Communities began to view warfare not simply as a temporal struggle, but as an event embedded in a larger cosmological framework, where human actions had spiritual implications. Temples were fortified, religious ceremonies became more elaborate, and divine favor was invoked as justification for both defense and expansion. The intertwining of faith with military action reinforced societal cohesion and provided psychological support to those who had endured the horrors of combat. Economically, the war triggered new forms of resource management. Grain stores, livestock, and tools became not just tools of survival, but strategic assets to be protected and allocated with precision. Some early historians suggest that the First War prompted the invention of accounting systems, as leaders needed to track supplies for both civilians and soldiers. The distribution of resources became a political act, and control over wealth often translated into influence over both military and civic life. In this way, warfare directly influenced the development of early bureaucracy and the concept of governance through structured resource management. Perhaps most importantly, the First War forced humans to confront mortality and the fragility of life. Prior to organized conflict, death was often a private or sporadic event. But warfare made mortality a communal and highly visible reality. Public mourning, memorialization, and storytelling became integral to coping with loss. Societies began to recognize that life was contingent on both human effort and the unpredictable forces of fate. This awareness contributed to the emergence of philosophical thought, ethical reflection, and early historical record-keeping. In essence, the experience of war taught humanity to consider existence itself, to measure action, consequence, and legacy. The war also left a mark on education and knowledge transmission. The need to train future warriors, administrators, and citizens in both practical and moral lessons led to early educational frameworks. Skills such as weapon handling, strategic planning, negotiation, and observation of enemy movements were taught alongside communal values, creating a multi-dimensional curriculum that prepared individuals for both survival and leadership. Knowledge of the battlefield became as prized as knowledge of the fields, and young people were immersed in traditions that blended practicality with cultural identity. Finally, the aftermath of the First War underscored the delicate balance between destruction and creation. While the conflict had brought death and devastation, it had also catalyzed progress. New technologies, social structures, and moral frameworks emerged directly from the crucible of combat. Communities learned that survival required adaptability, cooperation, and foresight. The first recorded war was not merely an episode of violence. It was a turning point in the human story, demonstrating that even the most devastating experiences could forge stronger, more complex societies. In conclusion, the First War left an indelible imprint on the trajectory of human civilization. It shaped political hierarchies, advanced technology, reinforced cultural norms, influenced religious practices, transformed economies, and altered psychological perspectives. Above all, it highlighted the human capacity to endure, adapt, and organize in the face of unprecedented challenges. The echoes of this ancient conflict resonate through time, reminding us that even the earliest battles were more than clashes of armies. They were defining moments in the story of what it means to be human. Section 9. Cultural shifts and daily life after the First War. The first recorded war, fought between the city-states of Lagash and Umma, left an enduring legacy not only on political and military structures, but also on the very texture of daily life and culture. While armies disbanded and the immediate violence subsided, the war's impact persisted in ways both visible and subtle, shaping social behaviors, cultural norms, and the ways communities conceptualized existence. For the survivors, life could never truly return to what it had been before the clash, and the adaptations they made revealed the profound ways in which war can catalyze societal evolution. One of the most visible shifts occurred in settlement patterns and urban planning. Prior to the conflict, villages and small towns often grew organically, with little attention to defense or centralized structure. The chaos and destruction witnessed during the war exposed vulnerabilities in these loosely organized settlements. Families began to cluster closer together, often around fortified structures or communal buildings, prioritizing both protection and social cohesion. Defensive walls became commonplace, not only around city centers, but also surrounding grain stores, water reservoirs, and sacred sites. Watchtowers and raised platforms allowed for early detection of potential threats, demonstrating that war was now an architectural as well as a martial concern. These changes had a lasting impact on the development of cities, laying the groundwork for complex urban societies where defense, resource management, and social interaction were carefully integrated. Another domain profoundly affected by the war was agriculture and food security. In a world where subsistence was precarious, the loss of crops, livestock, or able-bodied laborers could be catastrophic. Communities developed collective storage systems, creating granaries and communal food reserves that were meticulously tracked and managed. Leaders realized that sustaining a population required not only protection from external threats, but also meticulous planning of internal resources. Farming techniques were refined, irrigation systems improved, and crop diversity increased to reduce vulnerability to both environmental challenges and potential conflict. This emphasis on food security reinforced communal bonds, as neighbors relied on each other to cultivate, protect, and share resources. The psychological impact of war also reshaped family structures and social roles. In the aftermath of combat, many households had lost adult males, creating gaps in leadership and labor. Women and the elderly often assumed new responsibilities, from managing households to overseeing community tasks and even organizing local militias. This temporary redistribution of roles introduced a subtle yet enduring recognition of the flexibility and resilience of social structures. The experience highlighted the importance of every individual's contribution to survival and gradually led to norms where multiple generations collaborated in ways previously uncommon. Children, too, were incorporated into this adaptive system, learning practical skills earlier to ensure the continuity of family and community life. In the cultural sphere, the war inspired the creation of new artistic expressions and rituals. Painters, sculptors, and storytellers began to depict battle scenes, heroism, and the suffering of civilians, capturing both the glory and the tragedy of conflict. These early artworks were not mere decoration. They served as tools for education and memory, teaching future generations about courage, sacrifice, and the consequences of aggression. Oral traditions flourished alongside material culture, as elders recounted tales of strategy, bravery, and even moral failings during the war. Through these narratives, society established behavioral norms, reinforcing communal values such as loyalty, courage, and collective responsibility. Religion and spirituality were likewise intertwined with these stories, as divine favor was invoked both to justify actions during the conflict and to provide comfort in its aftermath. The First War also had a profound effect on trade and economic practices. Intercity commerce, once relatively informal, became more structured as communities sought to recover and stabilize. Merchants had to navigate both the threat of renewed hostilities and the practical need for consistent supplies. Trade routes were reinforced, agreements formalized, and barter systems standardized. In addition, the war spurred early forms of financial record-keeping, as leaders and merchants tracked resources, debts, and obligations with increasing precision. This nascent economic sophistication was directly tied to the lessons of conflict. The survival of a city-state depended not only on military strength, but also on its ability to manage wealth, resources, and human labor efficiently. Social hierarchy and leadership evolved in response to the demands of war. While the battlefield revealed the importance of strong, decisive leaders, post-war society recognized that governance required more than martial prowess. Leaders needed strategic vision, the ability to mediate disputes, and the capacity to coordinate labor and resources. Councils of elders or advisors often assumed greater prominence, providing balance and continuity in decision-making. This combination of centralized authority and distributed governance became a model that would influence political systems for centuries, demonstrating that the First War had not only immediate consequences, but also long-term implications for civic organization and leadership. The collective trauma of the conflict had profound psychological and social effects. Survivors had witnessed loss, destruction, and death on an unprecedented scale, forcing communities to grapple with grief, fear, and existential reflection. Mourning rituals became more formalized, often incorporating both public commemoration and private reflection. Communities began to build memorials, dedicate sacred spaces, and perform ceremonial practices to honor the dead and seek protection for the living. These rituals were not only a coping mechanism, but also a means of strengthening social cohesion, binding survivors together through shared experience and collective memory. Interestingly, the war also encouraged the development of early scientific observation and knowledge recording. Military needs demanded accurate maps, understanding of terrain, weather patterns, and the movement of resources. Leaders and scribes meticulously documented these observations, creating records that extended beyond immediate strategic use. This accumulation of knowledge influenced agriculture, trade, and environmental management, revealing how the pressures of warfare can accelerate the pursuit of practical knowledge. In essence, the First War acted as a catalyst for systematic observation, laying the groundwork for early forms of empirical reasoning that would shape human understanding in centuries to come. Education and skill transmission were also reshaped by the conflict. Young members of the community learned lessons not only in practical skills, such as farming, crafting, and combat, but also in ethics, leadership, and communal responsibility. Storytelling became a medium for both entertainment and instruction, blending moral lessons with practical guidance. As a result, even the youngest members of society were integrated into a system that emphasized preparedness, resilience, and adaptability. The war had transformed learning from a purely survival-based endeavor into a comprehensive cultural experience, encompassing both technical proficiency and moral education. In the broader sense, the First War influenced how communities conceptualized time, history, and progress. Events were recorded, remembered, and interpreted not merely as isolated incidents, but as part of an ongoing narrative connecting past, present, and future. People began to understand that actions had consequences beyond the immediate moment, shaping societal structures, cultural norms, and political dynamics. This nascent sense of historical consciousness allowed communities to plan, anticipate challenges, and preserve lessons for posterity, demonstrating that warfare, though destructive, also stimulated cognitive and cultural sophistication. Finally, the aftermath of the First War emphasized the delicate balance between destruction and renewal. While the conflict had caused loss and upheaval, it also prompted innovation, adaptation, and the strengthening of social bonds. Communities learn to endure adversity, organize efficiently, and transmit knowledge effectively. The legacy of the First War was not merely one of violence. It was a complex tapestry of resilience, creativity, and cultural growth, illustrating that even in the harshest circumstances, human societies possess an extraordinary capacity to transform challenge into opportunity. In conclusion, the first recorded war profoundly reshaped the cultural, social, and psychological landscape of early human civilization. From settlement patterns and urban planning to trade, education, and artistic expression, the conflict left an indelible mark on how communities organized themselves, remembered their experiences, and prepared for the future. Daily life, once governed by routine and survival, became intertwined with lessons learned from the battlefield. The echoes of this first war remind us that human societies are defined not only by conflict, but by their remarkable ability to adapt, innovate, and endure in its wake. Section 10. The Evolution of Warfare and the Lessons Learned. The first recorded war between Lagash and Umma was more than a singular event in human history. It was the crucible in which the concepts of organized warfare, strategy, and political negotiation were forged. For the communities involved, the conflict offered lessons that extended far beyond the battlefield, affecting the development of leadership structures, military organization, societal priorities, and even philosophical perspectives on human conflict. This section explores how the early experience of war shaped the evolution of armed engagement and the ways people learned to conceptualize, prepare for, and respond to violence. One of the most significant outcomes of the conflict was the emergence of structured military organization. Prior to the war, fighting groups were typically ad hoc collections of able-bodied men, organized in loose formations without standardized training or hierarchy. The clash between Lagash and Umma revealed the limitations of such informal structures. Leaders observed that discipline, coordination, and clearly defined roles were critical for both success and survival. In response, communities began to experiment with permanent warrior classes, assigning ranks, developing training regimens, and establishing routines that emphasized cohesion and tactical awareness. This early professionalization of military roles laid the foundation for the more sophisticated armies of later civilizations, illustrating that necessity drives innovation in ways that have enduring cultural impact. The First War also highlighted the importance of logistics and resource management in warfare. Armies could not simply rely on foraging or ad hoc supply. Sustained campaigns required careful planning of food, water, weapons, and equipment. Leaders learned to maintain supply lines, store reserves, and account for attrition, realizing that a well-fed and equipped army was often more decisive than sheer numbers alone. This focus on logistics also influenced civilian life. Communities developed granaries, coordinated labor, and implemented measures to protect critical resources from both enemy raids and environmental challenges. In this sense, the war indirectly stimulated advances in administration, record-keeping, and organizational complexity, showing that military imperatives can catalyze broader societal progress. Another profound lesson was the value of strategic planning and intelligence. The ability to anticipate enemy movements, identify weak points, and exploit terrain became paramount. Scouts and informants emerged as early intelligence assets, providing crucial information that could sway the outcome of battles. Maps and rudimentary diagrams were created to represent geographic features, troop placements, and logistical routes. This attention to information gathering and analysis represents an embryonic form of strategic thinking that would evolve into complex military theory over centuries. The First War demonstrated that success was rarely a matter of chance. Careful observation, planning, and timing were decisive. Political structures were also reshaped by the experience of conflict. Leaders realized that war was not solely a military endeavor, but a multi-dimensional process involving diplomacy, alliances, negotiation, and post-conflict governance. Treaties and peace agreements, often documented on clay tablets or inscribed monuments, established boundaries, regulated resource access, and mediated disputes. These agreements were among the first recorded examples of formalized international diplomacy, illustrating that human societies quickly recognize the necessity of balancing military action with negotiation. The interplay between coercion and conciliation became a defining feature of political life, influencing governance structures for generations. The psychological impact of war was equally significant. Combatants and civilians alike experienced fear, trauma, and uncertainty, prompting the development of rituals, taboos, and belief systems designed to cope with mortality and unpredictability. Religious practices often incorporated elements of protection, appeasement, and prophecy, reflecting the desire to understand and influence events beyond human control. Leaders invoked divine favor to legitimize decisions, inspire troops, and enforce social cohesion. Over time, the war encouraged a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between human agency, morality, and the forces that shape collective outcomes, laying the groundwork for ethical and philosophical reflection on conflict. Cultural transmission was profoundly affected by the First War. Stories of heroism, strategic brilliance, and tragic loss were preserved through oral tradition, eventually supplemented by written records. These narratives served multiple functions. They educated future generations about tactics, valor, and social responsibility. They reinforced collective memory and identity, and they offered a lens through which communities could process trauma and derive meaning. Artistic expressions, from carvings and reliefs to ceremonial performances, immortalized significant events and figures, transforming ephemeral experiences into enduring symbols. The war thus catalyzed cultural innovation, demonstrating that even destructive events can give rise to lasting creative and intellectual achievements. Technological adaptation also accelerated as a consequence of conflict. The need for improved weaponry, defensive structures, and mobility drove experimentation and invention. Early metallurgical techniques were refined to produce stronger, more durable tools and weapons. Fortifications were enhanced with walls, gates, and watchtowers that incorporated lessons learned from previous vulnerabilities. The development of simple siege techniques and protective armor reflected a practical understanding of physics, engineering, and material science, illustrating that necessity can spur innovation in ways that benefit both military and civilian life. Communities that engaged with these technological challenges gained strategic advantage, reinforcing the link between knowledge and power. Economic systems evolved in tandem with military and political developments. War required the coordination of labor, the allocation of resources, and the management of wealth. Communities established taxation or tribute systems to support sustained military campaigns, formalizing mechanisms that had previously been informal or ad hoc. Trade networks became more organized to ensure access to critical materials, and local economies adapted to meet the needs of both warriors and civilians. These innovations had long-lasting effects, establishing practices that would underpin future economic and administrative systems. In essence, the First War acted as a catalyst for complex societal organization, demonstrating the interdependence of military, political, and economic factors. Finally, the war encouraged the conceptualization of history itself. By recording events, strategies, and outcomes, communities began to develop a sense of temporal continuity, connecting past, present, and future. This early historical consciousness enabled societies to learn from previous mistakes, anticipate challenges, and plan for sustainability. Leaders, scribes, and storytellers collectively contributed to a growing repository of knowledge, ensuring that lessons from the battlefield could be applied to governance, resource management, and cultural development. The First War, therefore, did more than claim lives or redraw boundaries. It shaped the very way humans understood time, causality, and collective experience. In conclusion, the first recorded war was not merely an isolated military engagement. It was a transformative event that influenced multiple dimensions of human life, from military organization and logistics to governance, culture, and historical consciousness. The conflict reshaped the way societies thought, planned, and acted. The lessons learned from this war extended far beyond the battlefield, informing the evolution of human civilization in ways that resonate even today. By studying this formative conflict, we gain insight into the complex interplay between violence, innovation, and social development, recognizing that even the most destructive events can leave a lasting imprint on the trajectory of humanity. Section 11. The legacy of the First War and its impact on civilization. The first recorded war between Lagash and Umma was not merely a clash of armies. It marked a turning point in the evolution of human societies. Its legacy extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping governance, culture, technology, and even the philosophical understanding of conflict. To truly grasp the profound impact of this early conflict, we must examine how it influenced subsequent generations and how its lessons continue to resonate in the broader tapestry of human history. One of the most lasting legacies of this conflict was the institutionalization of political authority. Leaders recognized that effective governance required not only charisma and personal prowess, but also the capacity to organize, administer, and protect their communities systematically. The need to mobilize resources, coordinate armies, and negotiate with neighboring polities led to the establishment of formal hierarchies, legal codes, and bureaucratic structures. These early administrative innovations were essential in maintaining social cohesion during and after periods of conflict, and they served as blueprints for future civilizations. In this way, war acted as a catalyst for the evolution of governance, transforming loosely organized communities into structured societies capable of sustaining long-term stability. The conflict also underscored the importance of urban planning and defensive architecture. The experiences of the battlefield revealed vulnerabilities in settlements, prompting communities to rethink the design and fortification of their cities. Walls, gates, watchtowers, and strategically planned streets emerged not only as defensive measures, but also as symbols of authority and civic pride. The lessons learned from protecting population centers informed the construction of future cities, shaping the trajectory of urban development across Mesopotamia and beyond. As a result, war indirectly fostered innovations in engineering, architecture, and community organization, demonstrating how adversity can drive ingenuity. Cultural memory and identity were profoundly influenced by the First War. The collective experiences of conflict, loss, and triumph became integral to the narratives that communities told about themselves. Oral histories, artistic depictions, and early written records preserved the exploits of leaders and soldiers, the strategies employed, and the outcomes of key battles. These narratives served multiple functions. They educated future generations, reinforced social norms, and provided a framework for interpreting events and making decisions. The war thus played a pivotal role in the emergence of historical consciousness, encouraging societies to reflect on their past, learn from it, and envision their place in a larger continuum. The First War also accelerated technological innovation, particularly in areas related to weaponry, transportation, and communication. Communities sought to gain advantages on the battlefield, experimenting with new materials, tools, and methods of combat. Improved weapons, including more durable spears, axes, and defensive shields, were developed, alongside strategies to optimize their effectiveness. The construction of fortified structures and the strategic use of terrain demonstrated an early understanding of engineering principles. Additionally, the war highlighted the importance of communication, both for coordinating troops and for relaying information across distances. Signal systems, messengers, and simple cartographic representations emerged as vital tools, laying the groundwork for future innovations in information management and military technology. Economically, the war underscored the interdependence of resource management, labor, and trade. Armies required food, tools, and materials, necessitating more sophisticated systems of production and distribution. Communities began to specialize in certain crafts or agricultural products, exchanging goods and services with neighboring regions to meet the demands of both civilian and military needs. This specialization and trade not only supported wartime efforts, but also contributed to the development of complex economies, highlighting the broader societal impact of conflict. The war thus became a driving force behind the emergence of economic systems capable of sustaining large populations and organized polities. The psychological and social dimensions of the First War were equally significant. Exposure to conflict fostered the development of rituals, religious practices, and ethical frameworks designed to interpret, manage, and mitigate human suffering. Leaders invoked divine favor to legitimize decisions and inspire morale, while communities developed taboos, ceremonies, and moral codes that reinforced social cohesion. These practices reflected a growing awareness of the human capacity for both violence and cooperation, as well as the need to balance fear, courage, and moral responsibility. In essence, the war contributed to the evolution of ethical thought, illustrating that understanding human behavior and managing social order were as critical as battlefield tactics. The conflict also had profound implications for diplomacy and international relations. Following the cessation of hostilities, treaties and agreements were negotiated to establish boundaries, regulate resource access, and mediate disputes. These early forms of diplomacy demonstrated an understanding that sustainable peace required negotiation, compromise, and formalized mechanisms for conflict resolution. Such agreements were often recorded on clay tablets, serving as tangible evidence of the importance of legal and diplomatic frameworks. This recognition of diplomacy as a complement to military action foreshadowed the complex systems of alliances, treaties, and international law that would emerge in later civilizations. Education and knowledge transmission were also influenced by the First War. The strategies, outcomes, and societal responses to conflict were meticulously recorded, providing a foundation for future learning and strategic thinking. Scribes, storytellers, and educators preserved these lessons, ensuring that the collective experience of war could inform subsequent generations. This early emphasis on documentation and analysis not only facilitated improvements in military strategy, but also contributed to broader intellectual developments, encouraging critical thinking, problem solving, and historical awareness. Moreover, the war demonstrated the interconnectedness of human societies. The ripple effects of conflict extended beyond the immediate combatants, influencing neighboring regions and distant communities. Refugee movements, trade disruptions, and political realignments illustrated that war was not a localized phenomenon, but a force with far-reaching consequences. Understanding this interconnectedness prompted societies to develop mechanisms for coordination, communication, and mutual support, laying the groundwork for more complex interregional relations and fostering a sense of shared destiny among disparate communities. The ecological impact of the war, though often overlooked, was also significant. Military campaigns disrupted agriculture, altered landscapes, and stressed local ecosystems. Communities learned to adapt, developing methods for land management, water control, and resource conservation that balanced immediate needs with long-term sustainability. These lessons were integrated into subsequent settlement planning, agricultural practices, and economic strategies, demonstrating that even the destructive forces of war could catalyze innovation and environmental awareness. Finally, the war's legacy can be observed in the enduring human fascination with heroes, morality, and the consequences of conflict. Stories of bravery, cunning, canning, and ethical dilemmas continue to captivate the imagination, shaping literature, art, and philosophy. The First War established a precedent for examining the complexities of human behavior in times of crisis, fostering reflection on leadership, justice, and the nature of power. These cultural and intellectual explorations remain central to our understanding of conflict, reminding us that the lessons of the past are invaluable for navigating the challenges of the present and future. In conclusion, the first recorded war was a transformative event that left a lasting imprint on human civilization. Its influence extended across political, technological, economic, cultural, and intellectual spheres, shaping the trajectory of societies for generations. From the establishment of governance structures and military organization to the development of diplomacy, ethical thought, and historical consciousness, the lessons of the war were manifold. By studying this conflict, we gain insight into the profound ways in which human societies adapt, innovate, and evolve in response to the challenges of survival, cooperation, and conflict, demonstrating that even in destruction, there is the seed of progress.